So I recently ran into an issue where a client was using their EAP benefits and I thought they were using their health insurance benefits, and it ended up costing us both a lot of time. And so today I wanted to talk about what EAPs are, how they work, what the benefits are of them, what the limitations are of them, and what you need to know as a therapist about EAPs to avoid making the mistakes that I made. And that's what we're gonna talk about in today's video. But before we do, if you haven't done so already, please go ahead and subscribe down below. Hit the thumbs up button on this video. Only if you want to though, there is no pressure. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the difference between an EAP and an insurance plan. Now this whole thing can get really confusing, but let's make it really simple. So EAP typically stands for Employee Assistance Program. So if an employer chooses to give their employees an EAP, there's a whole bunch of benefits that typically come with this. And one of those benefits is often mental health services. Now these services are typically free of charge for the actual employee, the person using the benefits, and they're very time limited. So what I usually see is people get allotted, 1 to 5 sessions per month, something like that. And then the EAP will not cover it, and then they need to use their insurance. Now, in an EAP can be a standalone company, something like Lyra or Health Advocate, and sometimes EAPs are actually built into insurance providers. So Aetna has one, Cigna has one, and that's where it gets a little bit confusing. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. And then health insurance, which is different than an EAP, is ongoing healthcare coverage. So it usually includes medical, dental, vision, this kind of thing. And a lot of times mental health is covered in that coverage. And then for people who want to use health insurance to cover their mental health care, they will typically look for providers who are in network. So providers can be either in network or out of network. And when it comes to insurance coverage for mental health care, there's typically co-pays, co-insurance, deductibles, that kind of thing. So I guess the point here is that we have health insurance, which most people know about, and then we have an EAP. And that is where people usually get confused. So let's now talk about what happens when a client uses EAP benefits and how you could avoid the mistakes that I made. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what you need to know when it comes to an EAP. And the first thing you need to know is that they're often time limited. I mentioned this before. Now EAPs will only allot people a certain number of sessions, and it's typically not a lot. 1, 3, 5, sometimes it's like that. Sometimes clients can renew the sessions they're allowed, and other times they just have like 3 and then they're done. Now the issue with that is that clients who use their EAP benefits know that they have a time limited number of sessions. So I've found that when a client comes in and they're using EAP, and especially if I don't know it, they're planning to only use that amount of sessions and then decide what they want to do next. So sometimes those clients will start and then terminate really early. And as a therapist, you don't get much work done in 1 to 3 sessions. It requires more than that for sure. So to know that upfront would be really, really helpful. And actually I did have this case once where a client came in and they were using an EAP benefit, but they were using it through their insurance. I think it was Aetna. So they just told me they had Aetna. I didn't know that they had an EAP. I should have asked directly. I should have said, are you using EAP or are you not? I now ask that question to all of my clients to make sure that I know whether they're using EAP or not. Anyway, they decided to come in. I thought they were using Aetna. We had the first session. And after that, I realized that they told me they were using an EAP benefit and they only had, I think, 3 or 4 sessions. And they ended up terminating after the 3 or 4 sessions, which is fine. And I'm happy to have worked with them even for that short amount of time. And it would have been really helpful for me to plan my future schedule and other things if I had known right off the bat that it was going to be so time limited. And the other 2 things that are really important to know about EAP benefits are that the CPT codes that you can use are really limited. So let's say you're contracted with an insurance company and you get a whole list of codes you can use. For example, you can do an intake, 90791 usually, a 45-minute session, 90834, a 60-minute session, 90837. There's a whole bunch of codes that you can use. Typically with an EAP, you can only use 2, 3, or 4 different codes. And the EAP will let you know what codes you can use. So for example, I had a client who came in, and again, I made the mistake. I forgot to ask them whether they were using their EAP. I do an intake with them, which is probably my longest, most in-depth session. A lot of questions, a lot of forms. And I realized that the EAP does not contract a 90791, which is an intake assessment. They only contracted a 90834, which is a 45-minute session. So this is a pretty big issue. I was able to resolve it, but if I had known that up front, I could have prepared for this session differently. So you do need to know if you are taking EAP clients, you need to know which codes the EAP allows for. It's much more limited than regular insurance. Now I will say, and this is where it gets really tricky, let's say someone comes in and they're using their EAP benefits through Aetna. You need to look at your Aetna contract to see what the EAP specific codes are. So Aetna will actually sneak in, I don't know if they're actually sneaking it, but it's pretty sneaky to me. They'll put in the EAP codes and the EAP benefits into the contract that you sign. Now I read every single thing that I'm signing. It's like 75 pages of contract, like fine print, very detailed. And inside of those 75 pages, mixed in with your regular contract, like insurance in-network coverage, you'll find your EAP contract, right? So what codes are allowed for EAP with Aetna. The same goes for Cigna. So you wanna make sure that if you're contracted independently with different insurance companies, you wanna take a look to see if they have EAP benefits that you've signed up for, or that you've said that you will accept EAP clients. You wanna make sure you know exactly what the codes are, what you're allowed to do. And then the second thing is the reimbursement rates for EAP are typically much lower. And again, you take a look at the contract to see what the reimbursement codes are for the EAP benefits. And these are two things that I often find are overlooked, and it's not the therapist's fault. Like, how are you supposed to know? It's buried in unless you've read it from head to toe, which I do encourage you to do. You should read all the fine print. Unless you read it all though, and even if you do, sometimes it's really confusing. Like, why are there two different rates and two different codes? And sometimes it's because there's EAP and then there's the in-network coverage. So make sure if you signed up or you signed a contract with any insurance providers, you're well aware of the EAP benefits that you've signed up to take. Right, so then where does this leave us? So there's a couple things that I want you to take away from this video. And the first takeaway is just to be aware of when a client's actually using their EAP benefits versus their insurance coverage. Sometimes they don't even know because it's really confusing. So before you decide to see a client, make sure you ask them and get some clarity there. The second thing you want to be aware of is whether or not you're even contracted to see EAP. Sometimes you are contracted and you don't even know it. So if you're independently contracted with insurance companies, whether that be Aetna, Cigna, United, go ahead and review your contract and just see if there's anything about EAP in there, whether or not you've agreed to take EAP clients or you haven't. So just be aware about your standing with any EAP companies. And then finally, if you are deciding to take EAP, you want to be aware of the different codes you're allowed to use and the different reimbursement rates. And you'll find that on the contract. Oh yes, and let me not forget, people often ask, why would you take an EAP in the first place? It seems like there's low reimbursement rates. It seems like the codes are limited. What's good about it from a provider perspective? And the main reason you might want to take EAP is to have your practice grow. Maybe you just started and you're looking to build up a caseload, or maybe you're going into some of the summer slowdown season and you want to increase the referrals. Contracting with an EAP is a good way to start building a caseload. Now, it's not for everyone because there's a lot of limitations there. And so now that you watch this video, you're a little bit more aware of what an EAP is. And so now you can decide for yourself whether or not you want to work with EAP. And so then that's really it for today's video. If you were able to bear with me, even though I'm wearing this ridiculous shirt, thank you so much. I hope you learned something. I hope you found this helpful. At the very end of the day, I hope you're more motivated to thrive in private practice than you were when you clicked in the video. And I'll see you in the next one.